Well, John's garden fine Range Rover is certainly taking far longer to get to the MOT station than I first imagined, but we are inching closer. The new fuel lines are in position, and once the tank's back in and connected up, we might finally get this thing to start. Right, well here we go. This is a good moment. We have our fuel tank. It's looking spick and span on the inside and the outside, and so it's now basically the last thing to fit onto our Range Rover before we can find out whether we've solved all the leaks on our fuel system. So the first thing I want to do is then take out what now basically plugs so that I can put in a brand new fuel tank sender. So here it is. Now on our new sender you can see we've got a little tiny sort of little plastic noggin coming out the top there, another one on the bottom, and obviously that locates this sender the right way up. Now I think one might be slightly bigger than the other, but you could tell that it makes a difference because obviously at the moment that's where the float or the bob can actually go to the bottom of the tank. If I was to get it upside down, then you can see obviously when you've got half full it would say kind of half full, but of course then it would say empty when the tank was full. So it is quite important to make sure that it's actually the right way up. So I'm just going to pop that in there like so. And it's got two little, got a top and a bottom part we have to get into the right place. Like so. So that's good. So then the next thing to do is the new fuel pump. So I'm just going to take out again what now amounts to nothing more than just a plug or a cap just to fill a hole while I was doing all the cleaning. And it was a tiny bit leaky, and that's basically because of a failed sort of insulated connector, if you like. So there used to be a little pin that used to come out of there, a little spade, that of course then was connected off, and obviously that had broken off at some point. So I guess someone had decided to stick a wire through that, which meant there was a bit of a gap. I could have welded it up, but it was actually fine. Okay, so get rid of that. So then we have our brand new fuel pump. Look at that. So this will go very well back inside our tank. All those shiny surfaces now going to match. Nobody's ever going to see them. It's one of those things. Right, so just trying to get the first two in to make sure that the gasket and the fuel pump flange line up nicely with the bolt holes. It'd be a shame to cross thread anything at this stage. Okay, so just double check they're all nice and tight so the gasket can do its job and seal properly. So right, that's it. So the next stage is to fit this slightly ridiculous bit of pipe here, because obviously see this end goes onto the fuel pump here, and it goes all the way around to the fuel filter, which of course is on the chassis leg there. And these bits of foam just stop the pipe from rattling and rubbing against both the tank but also the chassis. Okay, yeah, I have to get even more. But I might even just pop over there. I don't think you'd ever get access to this when the tank is in position, but just in case you can, I'm just going to put it to the side so that should we need to get to it, it should be a little bit easier. Having said that, if we had to drill a hole in the floor to get to it, then it would be hard. Right, nice. So these little chaps sort of sit around here somewhere. I'm not sure if that goes over the top or underneath yet, but that's basically pretty much ready. We've already got the filler pipe reattached to the car, and we've got the breather pipe also still attached to the car. So now I can think about trying to get this into the vehicle. It's getting very exciting. We're nearly at the point where we can try this again. I mustn't forget I have the protective shield to go on the bottom. Like so, again, freshly painted just to make it look a little bit tidier. And now, I'm going to be a bit clever here, I'm now going to pop on a couple of bolts and some washers. So let's hope I can do this with a bit of a juggle. Should be a lot easier. Now I don't have to worry about things like fuel. Okay. First of all, got to get that into that little hole there, and then I can use my head, as my teachers always said I should. Obviously, it would be just as easy to use some kind of transmission stand or jack. Some would say even better. Right, so our brand new fuel lines are now part of the car, which is quite wonderful. They're connected to a fully refurbished fuel tank, and we've got a fuel filter, a new pump, and a new sender. So pretty much there's not much left on the fuel system that I need to change, so I'm hoping it's now going to work. Do you know what? I didn't think it was possible, but all these nice new looking parts make the car look even worse. Getting a weird sense of deja vu, putting in fresh new fuel into our Range Rover's fuel tank, but hopefully second time lucky, maybe sometime soon this thing is going to drive out of here. Gotta say, I'm getting quite excited now. We've got our refurbished fuel tank back where it belongs, attached to the underside of our Range Rover. We've got some new fuel lines connecting that fuel tank to the engine bay. I've also attached, or at least reattached, my magic button, so now the new fuel pump inside the tank is going to have its own dedicated supply, just so I can actually test that the new system is going to work. And then also to that end, I've disconnected the feed pipe here and put it into a bottle so I can see when the fuel comes out. Not if, but when that fuel comes out. So when I push this button, theoretically, we should hear a whir and hear some splashing. We have fuel, fantastic. The next thing I need to do is reconnect that hose to the rest of the fuel injection system and then check to see if any of that is going to leak. Right, so now I'll push the button again. We should hear the pump go, the fuel flow around the fuel injection system and back through the return. And hopefully there'll be no leaks, no fuel on the floor. So here we go. That's quite good. I can't hear any leaks. All I can hear is fuel flowing. I think we're on to the next stage. This is getting very exciting indeed. Right, so what we need now is a bigger battery, I think. So now I've finished with my magic switch, I can disconnect those wires and then connect the fuel pump to the wiring loom that comes with the car. Now you may notice there are a few little loose ends here. We've got actually a bit of the terminal that used to be attached to the original fuel sender, so that obviously needs to be sorted out, and then this one hasn't got a terminal at all. So I'll fix that, connect everything back up, and then hopefully this should work from the ignition. Now that is a bit of a shame, but it is also slightly inevitable. Rather than revealing a nice bit of shiny copper copper, we've got this sort of black oxide version, because obviously over time, it's been a lot of time, the wires here, the moisture of the air has got to that skin and actually formed this oxide layer. Now the problem with that is you will get a sort of electrical connection, but it won't be a very good one. There may be some added resistance. And the thing is, on this sender, the fuel sender, obviously that works on resistance, and therefore this is going to mean that there's going to be an inaccurate reading for one thing, but also it'd be just nice to get a really, really good connection. Now there are a number of ways of fixing this problem. One is you could just get some plumber's flux and you could just heat up the wire, dip it into that, rub it around, and you should get rid of most of that oxide, but it is a bit messy. You could try and have a go with a little bit of sandpaper, but the wires are quite small and you may remove them altogether. And another thing is you keep cutting the wire further and further back up the loom to try and find some clean copper, but then you may end up with not enough loom to connect everything together. So rather like the tank, I think I might go for a chemical solution. Now this is a two-stage process. The first one being some vinegar, so just lovely. And then the next stage is a bit of salt. Now it's normally about a cup of vinegar to about a tablespoon of salt, but obviously this is a smaller container than a cup. And I'm just going to dissolve that sodium chloride into our acid here. Now what you can do is you can add a lot more salt to the ratio and end up with a paste. That can be useful for other things, but this should be just right for our wires. That'll probably do. So then it really is as simple as in popping our wires into our solution and sort of jiggle them around a little bit. It's going to take a bit of time, but it's minutes rather than hours. Even from a distance this is looking good. Give it more of a jiggle. Oh, look at that! I'm just going to wipe off all the excess liquid, but that is amazing. So you can see we've now got lovely bright copper and no longer any of the copper oxide. So that's great, but the thing is of course that this chemical reaction is going to continue to sort of eat away at the copper if I don't block it. So that's the second part of the process, and that involves a little bit of bicarb and water. Right, so for this just need water, not even that much to be honest, and then a little bit of bicarbonate of soda. Again, just dissolve that. And then this alkali is then going to basically block the acid. It's just going to stop the chemical reaction. So our copper will be good to go. Let's transfer some electrons around, it'll be lovely. So now I'll just pop that back in there, just jiggle it around a bit, make sure it's nice and stirred. I might leave it for a sip, and then it should be ready to go in a second. Right, that should be more than enough. Oh, this is looking fantastic. So just again, dry these off. Right, well now that's dry and neutralised, you can see quite clearly that's lovely fresh copper ready to make a great electrical connection. It's a really handy trick. Right, so now we are ready for some crimps. I'm just going to twist that up. Pop that little chap on there like so. Same on the other two, and these two are the earth, so they're actually going to get wound together. So now it's time to disconnect the wires for my switch, reconnect it to the loom, and then pop these chaps into the sender. It's a bit fiddly and a bit close. We are tantalisingly close. I'm going to turn on the ignition. I was kind of hoping to hear the fuel pump just go on for a little burst, because on most modern fuel injection vehicles that's what you would hear. But bearing in mind that this is quite an early fuel injection car, it might work a bit differently. There is a way I can check to see if the pump is all connected up and all the wiring is in place and everything's working. I know we checked the fuse a long time ago, but it was all ready to go. So if I get into the engine bay, there's a little trick I can do while leaving the ignition on. Right, so on a Range Rover, particularly this model, there's obviously this device here, the airflow meter, which obviously measures the amount of airflow going through the air filter into the engine. Now, if I just undo these Jubilee clips, so I'll just open this up a little bit, take that out of the way, and you can see inside, you've got the air mass meter, and you can see there's a little door in there. Now, if I now operate this with a screwdriver, you can hear the fuel pump going on and off. So that means that all of our wiring for our fuel pump, all of that circuitry is working a treat. And if that's working, that means that we are right there. I reckon if we crank it over, the fuel pump's going to run, and with any luck, we might actually have this thing jump into life. It's getting almost too much to bear. Let's pop it back together again and see what happens next. Okay, so this is the moment we have been waiting for a long time. Ignition on. Here we go. Oh, no. It kind of nearly went. Just give it a bit of gas, perhaps. It sounds like it's got a little bit of a spark. But I don't know. Obviously, we know the fuel's flowing. That's really quite puzzling. Right, see if we do have a spark. Well, I've just disconnected an HT lead and then put in just a spark plug that I've got lying around, and then it's connecting, obviously, or it's touching the metalwork of the engine, so it should have a nice enough earth. So the idea is now if I crank over the engine, I should be able to see the spark, and that way we'll at least confirm whether we do or don't have a spark. This is turning out to be a bit of a quandary. We've definitely got loads of spark, which is good, and we know that when we operate our little door here, the fuel pump works. So if we've got fuel and we've got spark, we should definitely have bangs. Even if I've wobbled the dizzy and actually maybe not put it back in the right position, so the sparks aren't happening quite when they're supposed to, we still get some kind of bang, we still get some kind of sign of life, and there's nothing at the moment. Now what I'm wondering is, we know that the fuel pump works on the button for sure, but I haven't actually tested the fuel pump. Now it's reinstalled as part of the car. So even though we can hear it actually spinning up, don't know for sure that it's spinning the right way. So I think what I'll do is I'll just crack off that fuel line again, pop it into a bottle and operate it from here, and then let's see if we are getting some fuel. Okay, so here goes. Well, I can hear the pump spinning away merrily, but there's no fuel coming out. So that is our problem. So it's kind of good news, at least I know what's going on. So it's obviously something to do with the wiring at the other end. Right, well, let's have a look at this connector here. So if I just unplug it, it's actually quite a good seal. So I've got this one here, which is obviously the one that goes all the way up into the fuel tank. That's our new cable there, and then this is the original sort of socket, if you like, that was part of the car. Now, obviously the rest of it goes to the sender, so there's a common earth, so that's got to be correct. And then there's also the feed wire here, which then would normally take the 12 volts, which would then make the pump work. Now what's interesting is when I was playing around with my switch, I actually wired it up as I'd imagined, so I just figured that probably the brown was probably positive and the blue was probably negative, and in fact the pump then ran backwards. So I strongly suspect that if we swap those wires over, we might have some joy. So if I now just plug in my wire, so I put this one into the blue one there. So this blue one here normally connects to the black one, so if I now actually connect it to the other side, so I'll put it to what would normally be the feed, and then I'll do the same on the other side, so swap this one over as well, and then just pop that into the other one. So theoretically what was positive is now negative and vice versa. So with any luck, our pump should now actually produce fuel into the engine bay. Right, let's try again. Fantastic, so there we go, mystery solved. So all I have to do now is make that fix permanent. Right, now to make this fix permanent, what I need to do is somehow swap those wires over. Now, to do that, I could either have a look at obviously the wire that's going all the way into the fuel pump, or I could have a look at the stuff that's attached to the car. Now, if I use the original cable as an idea, if I just take off these other wires, don't need those anymore. Now, if I just hold that up, now the original wire would have been black, and then the new wire is blue, and then the original wire would have been white, and the new wire is brown. So interestingly, the wiring on both the old pump and the new pump are the same. So that's fine. So then it rather suggests that perhaps it's possible that in the factory, even though the cable's correct, that actually maybe how they were connected up onto the pump itself, somehow somebody got it wrong and mixed them up. Now, as far as the wiring on the car and also the sender, obviously we know that two of those wires were both earth, so they were already connected together in a broken contact. So I'm pretty confident that that's actually correct. And obviously the white wire with the green tracer is almost certainly going to be positive. So I think the car is fine. I think it's this that's the problem. But rather than kind of cut the wires and just solder them or use some crimps maybe to swap them over, I could perhaps just pull the pins out and then swap their positions and pop them back together again. So here goes. Okay, so the first thing I need to do is a little rubber bung on the back of the connector here. So now I've got my blue going to the right hand side, my brown going to the left. I'm now going to try and do, with any luck, if I just get a little Bradley thing, if I can do this, I'm going to try and pull the wires out of the thing at the same time as kind of wiggling them round. Now what I'm going to try and do, there's going to be two either brass or copper connectors in there, and they're going to have two little pins that sort of stick out of there, out of this pressed bit of metal that's been rolled into a tube, and then that's been shoved into this plastic holder. So those little kind of ears hold them in place. What I'm hoping is, if I can kind of wiggle it around, I might just be able to disturb one or the other, or both. Okay, there's one. Okay, got it. Right now, before I forget which was which, I'm going to put my brown wire where the blue wire used to be, and then the blue wire where the brown wire used to be. The only thing I can see as an issue with that is going to be our little grommet, but I think we should be able to wiggle it around enough. Just get that last little bit in there. Look at that. Fantastic. So we've now got our connectors back in our little plug. And the wires, although they're now kind of wrong for the wire, they are now correct for the fuel pump, which means I can just pop that little dust cover back in, reconnect it, and then we should be good to go, and our pump should produce fuel all the way into the engine bay. Right, there we go. Job done. Well, surely we are now there. We've got our refurbished fuel tank, we've got our new fuel lines, we've got our new fuel pump actually delivering fuel into the engine bay. We've got a spark. When I crank over this engine, she should just fire into life. But that is a job for today. Ignition on. Here we go. Well, that is fantastic. Johnny's not wrong, it runs beautifully. Now, I know I shouldn't rev it too much, but come on, this is just brilliant. What a moment. After all that faffing about, we now have a working Range Rover. Oh yes. It's taken far too many months to get John's garden fine Range Rover to actually run, but now it is running. I'm sure he's going to be stoked for one thing, but also it now means I can drive it out of the workshop and, as promised, to an MOT station, but not before I've checked all the fluids and given it a thorough clean. And all of that is a job for another day. Right, well this is a very big day. Last time we managed to get John's rotten old Range Rover to actually start, which was quite a moment. So the next obvious question is, does it actually drive? Now, John's memory of his Range Rover is rather rose-tinted to say the least, and apparently it drove into the garden. Well, whether it did or not, it's been standing there for a very long time before this very moment. So, if it does drive, I will honour my promise of actually getting it out of the workshop, giving it a thoroughly good clean before we take it down to the MOT to get a thoroughly big spanking, no doubt, with a massive list of failures and advisories. But first things first, let's get it out of the workshop. That does sound good. Now, this is a moment that many of you have been longing for. It's also a moment that many of you have been very concerned about. First of all, why hasn't it happened already? Also, there is so much vegetation on this vehicle, if I clean it all off, then it's no longer going to be carbon neutral. There are so many cobwebs on this vehicle that once they're gone, there'll be nothing holding the car together. In fact, there is so much rust that once that's actually fizzing away as we're washing it off, the car might actually dissolve completely, which might not be a bad thing, actually, thinking about it. Also, the fact that the doors don't shut also means that the interior is certainly going to get a wash, but that's no bad thing either. There's no getting away from it. This is going to happen. It's wash day for our Range Rover, and for that, I'm going to need some equipment. I need something a bit more sporty than that. That's more like it. But this car has got all kinds of things growing in it, so it's going to be quite toxic, so I need some proper protection. Right, let's do this. Now, John has said that he's called this car Daisy. Well, I'd like to give him a counter name perhaps. It's silver, it's covered in moss, at least it was. Maybe we should call it Sterling. Or perhaps Rusty. Even more of John's vintage filth. He's a dirty, dirty boy. Right, time to get deep into that grotty undercarriage. Well, that is looking so much better. It almost looks respectable. One last bit and we're ready for the MOT. Right, well now those of you that are keen-eyed will have noticed this is not an MOT station, and in fact the Range Rover is still very much stuck in the workshop. Well, it came to the point where I actually got to drive away, popped it into drive, and it kind of lurched into gear, which is not really a good sign. I thought, okay, I'll leave that, I'll keep going, see what happens, and eventually drive vanished altogether. Now, I've had a quick chat with John, and it turns out he does have a sort of vague recollection that perhaps the gearbox might have had an issue the last time he used it. Now, that was 12 years ago. It could be a catastrophic problem, or equally, it could be the fact that there was a little minor issue, and then since then, the hygroscopic fluid, the transmission fluid, that actually been absorbing water for all of those years. Now, obviously, water has very different properties to the oil that should be in the gearbox, which is we explain why it wouldn't necessarily work properly. So I'm going to try a little trick, just in case it gets us to the MOT station sooner rather than later. I'm going to drop out the oil while it's still a little bit warm, and I'm going to replace it with some brand new oil, put in a new filter, and just maybe that'll just give us a little bit more miles before we have to actually deal with the gearbox properly. But the other issue is once I was going, I then had to stop. And unfortunately, the pedal went pretty much straight to the floor, as you'd expect. I know the condition of the brakes is pretty poor, but I wasn't expecting to see any leaks just yet. Now, obviously, I've just topped up that fluid there, and you can see that the rear of the reservoir is actually still full of fluid. It's only the front that's now quite depleted, and obviously only just filled that up. So the issue must be that we have a leak. Now, I noticed there was a little bit of a sort of a trail left by the car on the driver's side, so it looks like it's going to be the front driver's side wheel that's going to need attention. So I'll drop the fluid first from the gearbox, and then I'll start looking at the brakes, and hopefully we will get to the MOT station today, maybe. Right, so back under the car, there is our engine, there is the bell housing of our automatic transmission, and there is the oil pan or the sump, and then of course you've got your little drain plug down there. But obviously to get to this, to actually take this off so I can get to the filter, which is actually inside the gearbox, I'm going to need to remove this cross member. Now thankfully it's bolted in, but of course those bolts have been there rusting for many, many years. And once it's removed, I suspect the chassis is going to kind of slightly move, making it harder to get back in. But the first thing I need to do is just start draining the old oil out, because of course that can take a bit of time just to finish dripping while I'm undoing everything else. Okay, so, and with any luck, first of all this will actually undo, and then hopefully the fluid will mostly go in the container. Oh dear, look at the state of that. Well, that isn't ideal. Now, this should be a nice bright pink colour. the fact that it's kind of this milky brown means that it's not only burnt, but also it's full of water. And now, having spun it up, I've now emulsified the whole thing. So this is definitely the right thing to do to drop this out. I might leave that draining for a while. Right, well, it's been a while, and now it's pretty much empty. I'm going to pop the sump plug back in, but not before you can tell, actually, a little bit of metal on there as well. The magnet on the top is doing its job and dragging any swarf away. So clearly, at some point, we are going to have a look at the gearbox in a serious manner, but at least for now, I'm not going to get dripped on. We've got rid of the nasty stuff. So now, I've just got to quickly drop out this cross member, and then I can start undoing the sump itself. Right, there are 4 bolts holding this cross member in position on both sides. Actually, they are coming apart slightly more easily than I was imagining, so that's good. Well, this one's a bit more tricky to get to, so just pop that on there. There's been a little bit of strengthening has been put in just here, and that's just getting in the way of the ratchet, but we've got some traction. It's coming apart. Right, so now it is time to gently coax this member away from the chassis. Now, it's obviously everything's undone and it's still kind of levitating, so we'll give it a bit of a tap. I'm hoping, possibly in vain, that it'll just pop out. So as I suspected, at the moment the chassis is just kind of pinching it into position. So I'm just going to keep coaxing it. I'm going to try and pull down. What I might even do is get a ratchet strap, stand on that to sort of keep applying sort of a force down while tapping it. So just see how far I get. Nope. Okay. Right, so just going to pop this down here like so, connect it like that, make sure I've got a loop that just gives me just enough room. Get my foot in there, pop it on there like so, and then, okay, so let's give this a go. So, that's much better, you see. It's edging down. Oh, it is out. So now, I can get to the sump. Right, so with the cross member out of the way, I can now start to remove things to get our sump out of the way to get to the filter, which I want to change. Now the first thing is this big nut here, and that's obviously for the filler pipe and where the little dipstick goes. Okay, there we go. So, a little bit of fluid may come out of here, so got my little bowl there. Actually, we're good, which is excellent. Just pop that there on the floor. So now the next thing is I can start going around all the bolts that actually hold the pan to the bottom of the gearbox. Now there are only 6 bolts holding this oil pan in place, and I'm hoping once they're undone I'll be able to sort of wiggle it past the exhaust. I don't want to have to keep taking things off this car just to get it to the MOT station. It's nuts. Oh, okay, so this is the last one. Oh, it's always the last little bit. Okay, so that is the last one. Let's see if I can wiggle this out. Oh, it's going to be tight, you know. It's going to be tight. Now the exhaust is already quite well damaged, so I might just try and prise it down just a little bit to release the sump, but I think no, maybe. Oh, there we go. Oh, that really is the worst condition transmission fluid I think I've ever seen. Well worth changing. Right now, so we've got to our transmission oil filter, which is this square thing just here. It's only held on with 3 little screws, but unfortunately somebody's been here before and they've absolutely mashed them. So they are a Torx sort of socket, at least they used to be. So the problem we have here is our sort of methods or opportunity to get these off are going to be quite limited. So first of all, I'll just try with the right Torx bit, and I'm going to give it a bit of a tap just to try and get it in past any mangled material. Oh no, see that's just not even. I'll try another one. So the issue we have is if we try and cut these or grind them or whatever, then of course we're going to end up with really unpleasant swarf flying around the gearbox potentially, and that'd be very bad. Oh, so we've done one. That is good. Of course it was the easiest one to get to as well, so that's going to be interesting. So there we go, so there's that. Now, let's try the middle one. You can see this one sort of holds where the pickup pipe is. Oh no, that's definitely spinning already. So I think the next thing to try and do, I'll just use some mole grips perhaps. It's a little bit, you know, a little bit cowboy, but I'll give it a go. So we'll grab hold of that and try and twist it at the same time. Maybe it'll come loose. Now first thing, just popping the Torx bit into position, then get the old moles on there. It's not ideal, but needs must. And get it on as tight as I can. Right, so now, also a little magic bit of impact driving at the same time on its lowest setting. Oh, let's see what happens. Nope, nope, and nope. Just try one more with this. No, it's not liking it at all. So the thing is, after this, we're either going to have to try a bit of heat or even something more drastic than that. No, it doesn't look like this is going to come. Now, the problem I have is if we were to grind a slot in the remaining 2 screw heads, then that would at least kind of give me some purchase perhaps for a bigger screwdriver bit or even an impact driver, but the problem is then all that grit could very easily fly around and get stuck to the gearbox. Now I could obviously maybe use a bit of cardboard perhaps to kind of cover the area just to try and make that a bit easier. And if I'm doing that, I could equally maybe get the old MIG welder out and actually weld another bolt onto the end of these nuts, and hopefully then that heat will penetrate through into the gearbox, freeing everything off. Oh, this really is so frustrating. But I reckon if we could just get the second screw out, then we might have a chance of using the whole of the filter to kind of rotate things round. And Dave, our cameraman, has come up with a brilliant idea, just to actually put a bit more pressure, a bit more sort of load onto the Torx bit as it's pushing into the screw to give it a bit more purchase. So the idea would be just to get a bit of metal. Got a trolley jack down here, and then also let's put in our socket like so, and then I'm just going to jack that up and effectively push it. So I'm starting to lift the whole car here, but right, so now, oh my word, look at that. He's only gone and done it. A round of applause for Dave. That is fantastic. So I'll just put that back over there. Now the great news about this is now I've got the second bolt out, what we might be able to do is actually kind of peel down the filter, because I've got the new filter here and you can just see there's like a little lip on this edge. Everything else is pretty much flat. So if I just pull this down, I'm kind of hoping, oh, there we go. Oh, so now I can actually rotate the whole of the filter around that sort of central point, and that's going to mean that that head is going to be moved within the thread, and of course that's also going to hopefully relieve things. So I might need a bit more pressure again. Right, so just going to pop in our Torx bit again, bring in the pole, add the pressure. So, okay, now I've got a lot of movement here. It's just got to be enough. I've got to try and pull that round at the same time as putting the socket. Oh, I think. Oh yes, look at that. Absolutely amazing. And that is really such a relief, because if this hadn't worked, I was then thinking about whether I'm filing some flats on the side, maybe grinding a slot in each of the heads. And of course all that means there's lots of grit flying around. Thankfully, we've had to manage to do this without compromising the gearbox in any way, which is quite wonderful. It's still really sticky though. And we're going to need some new bolts. Oh, that is fantastic. So our filter is now finally free. So now with that out of the way, the last thing we have to do before I can start putting everything back together again is to drain the fluid from the torque converter. Now inside the bell housing is our torque converter. It's basically a big metal donut, and inside it are sort of 2 half cups full of little fins. And what connects them is a load of liquid, this transmission fluid. And the idea is that the engine is spins one of these discs, if you like, with all these vanes, and those vanes then slosh the fluid around, and that then drags the other impeller around, and that's what's actually powering the gearbox and eventually giving you drive. And that's what allows you, in fact, in an automatic transmission car, to sit at the traffic lights with your foot on the brake but still be in drive. And as soon as you then take your foot off the brake, you can feel that drag starting to pull the car along, and as you accelerate, obviously this disc is actually sort of spinning faster and faster, the fluid sloshing around faster and faster and dragging the other impeller around. Now the thing is, it's full of this liquid, and of course we know the liquid is bad, so I need to drain it out. They very handily give me a little tiny observation hole, if you like. I can undo those 3 bolts, hopefully that plate will come out, and then in somewhere in there I'm going to have to spin the torque converter around. There should be another drain plug, but inside on this spinning thing. And then if I can get to that, undo it and drain it all out, then at least then we know that most of this horrible liquid is gone, and then we put in the new stuff, it's going to get pretty much everywhere. It'd probably be worth flushing out at a later date, but just for now, just to get as much of the bad stuff out as possible would be no bad thing. There we go. Aha. That's not what I was expecting. Ooh, there we go. Ugh. Wow. So, I've got like a biscuit of unpleasantness. So, that plug of dirt shows just how long ago this car was last looked at. Let's see what's inside. Right, so I've now put this big socket on the crank. And I've got a torch, I can actually see the torque converter inside. So if I just kind of crank over the engine very slowly, I can see the torque converter spinning around inside. And I'm looking for a drain plug. Now it's possible, this is early enough that it doesn't even have a drain plug, but if it does, I'd love to get that nasty fluid out. Right, there are 3 lobes on the torque converter. And that's how it's attached to the flex plate, which is what an automatic car has instead of a flywheel. So it's literally a plate that flexes with a ring gear on the outside so you can actually start the vehicle. So it's kind of easy to know. I think that's number 2. Looks like maybe number 3. So there isn't, it seems, a drain plug on here, which is kind of good and bad news. Basically, it'd be really lovely to get all that horrible old fluid out of here, but clearly that's not going to happen. And I guess it just means that when we put all the new fluid back in, it's just going to have to mix up, and as long as we're 90% there, at least we'll be 90% better than we were before we started this process. And I guess it means that a bit later down the line, we'll come and flush it all again, or perhaps, if I really needed to, we can actually take the engine off, then get to the torque converter, then drain it out and start again. But I suspect we're going to need to do some more work on the gearbox further down the line, so it's no bad thing. So there we are. I've sort of saved myself a job in a weird way, but it's because we don't have the drain plug. So I'll put everything back together again, and now we can start putting the new filter back in place and then start putting everything back in and then get some fluid in. Right, so this is our new oil filter. It's quite a simple affair, really. Now the first thing I need to do is just take off that pickup pipe from the old one, pop it over to the new one. It's very simple. Again, it just twists off. It says, there we go. And it's all fine. And then as you can see, there's a little O-ring just inside there. So we've got any one of those there. And I've got a little bit of oil just to wet that nicely. And then make sure that it's going to seal okay. Because after all, you need the fluid whizzing around the gearbox without any issues. So you want a nice seal on all the bits that are going to be sucking and blowing it about that gearbox. Right, so that's into position now. Tiny bit more transmission fluid just to be absolutely sure. And I can pop that into place. And then I've got a little spacer, mustn't forget. Pop that over there, like so. Now the only other thing I need to do is you notice on this side, where it's all rather manky, where that connector goes into the gearbox itself, into the valve body, there's another O-ring right there. So again, I'm just going to give that a little bit of fluid all the way around. Just gives it a better chance of sealing. And we'll just pop that on there. Like so. So now that should seal nicely when it goes back into the gearbox. Also got some new bolts, so ready to go. So that is now the oil filter in place. So now I need the sump, and we're on the way. We're making some progress at last. Now I just need to do a little bit of cleaning on this sump. I thought I'd just drain out the last of the oil and see what's underneath. And it's not looking good. It looks a little bit like chocolate sauce, which I don't think is supposed to be used in an automatic transmission. Now I fear that's the remains of all the paper clutches that will be inside there, so they've probably been dissolved by the water and the contamination. So this fix might not work, but it's always worth a try. Right, so I've just given our little sump a bit of a clean. Now it needs a brand new gasket, so I'm just going to pop this in place. Almost certainly going to happen is it's going to be knocked off again as I try and fettle it into position, but lots of starters we need to go on. So now it's going to pop up here. It was a bit of a battle to get off, but we'll see. Let's just try and get this into position in a cunning way. So, oh look at that. Nearly, and there we are. Now they're actually quite clever little clamps. You can see the sort of unequal length on either side of the screw. So the short side goes actually onto the pan, the long side goes onto the gearbox itself, and that way it stops the seal getting too crushed. Obviously, you're still going to torque it up correctly, but still, it's quite a smart idea. Right, these now, all the threads have just been a little bit started, so I can now just go around very slowly, doing up with a ratchet. But I'll just do a few turns on each just to get them into the right position. And just be mindful all the time that the seal is going to end up in the right position. Actually, the clean metal on the gearbox is helping me with that. So last thing to go back on here is the dipstick tube. It's a nice big nut here, and then once this is done up, we can go onto the top side and fill up the gearbox with some new transmission fluid. And then I guess the question will be, has this actually worked? Was all this effort worthwhile? Wonderful. Now, before I put the cross member back in, I thought I'd just give the chassis rails on either side a bit of a clean, just to get rid of the worst of that mud, because I think it's going to be a bit of a struggle. Right, that's clean enough, not quite concourse, but it'll do. So right now I'm just going to pop a little bit of grease just over this, just to help this membrane. As I say, what I'm worried about is that either side of the chassis are going to be coming inwards slightly, and that's going to sort of pinch the cross member and stop it from going in. And I have another trick up my sleeve just in case it's still a bit of a struggle. Okay, here goes. Found another secret stash of John's vintage filth. You know, I mean, I hope we could go on for a long time with that. Right, so it's now time for our cross member to go back in. Obviously, it is very gnarly. Could do with a lot of work, but I just want to get this in so we can get the car started again, drive it to the MOT, and find out what else it's going to fail on. Get a bolt anywhere near in. It's not far off. There we go, one in. There we go. So we've now got 2 bolts in position, so at least I can now start tightening things up. I'm just using a screwdriver to make sure I can get my bolt through my hole. I think you can see this has had a bit of manipulation over the years as John's stoved it into rocks, presumably. And I guess ultimately it holds the chassis together a bit and protects the transmission. Now I'm pretty sure this isn't going to be the last time that I remove and put back this cross member, but I'll still do them up nice and tight. Now with the cross member securely back in position, the last thing we have to do before I can lower the cart and put in the transmission fluid is pop in a brand new washer for the drain plug to make sure it doesn't leak. Lovely. Right, so we are getting quite close now. So, time for some fluid, 8.52 litres capacity, but bear in mind there is some still in the torque converter. And also I need to be checking the levels once the engine is running, and I've sloshed it through all the gears a few times as well. So I'm just going to put about 7 litres or so in first of all, then I'll start her up, then we'll start the rest of that process. But we'll then be able to find out whether this quick fix, which has taken forever, has actually worked. Right, well that's really exciting. The wheels are turning in all of the gears and it's a much smoother transition, so it could be that this quick fix is actually going to be good enough to get us to the MOT station. Just going to check the fluid. Right, okay, it's just a little bit over maximum, but that's okay because actually it's running a bit hotter than you normally test the fluid at, so that's okay. So if it's going to get us to the MOT station, the next thing we need to worry about is actually stopping rather than hitting the MOT station. And for that, I'm going to have to fix those leaky brakes. And that is a job for another day. Well, I'm still trying to get our Range Rover to the MOT test centre, and last time I did manage to get the transmission fluid changed, so at least it now has drive in most of the gears, and hopefully that's going to last long enough to get me all the way to there. But the problem now is to get it to stop. I noticed before when I was washing the vehicle that actually driving it around afterwards, there was really no braking at all. There was a bit of a leak, the pedal went right down to the floor, and I noticed there was some fluid on the driver's side on the floor. So what I need to now try and work out is where that leak is coming from and whether I can fix it quickly just to get me to the MOT station. Now obviously I've spent a bit of time underneath here already, and it's quite difficult to ignore the fact that the state of the brakes is quite appalling. Clearly they're going to fail at MOT, but then so is everything else. I just want a really big list we can go through with John and actually work out exactly how we're going to attack this and get it back on the road. Now you can see you've got things like brake pipes here that are particularly rusty. They've been stuck out in the elements, and obviously they've been kind of rotting away very, very slowly over time. So I suspect that the leak is going to come from one of these steel pipes more than perhaps one of the flexes, but equally it could be one of the calipers, that maybe those seals have gone, maybe they're leaking from there. So what I really want to do now is just work out exactly where the leak might be coming from, and obviously focus my investigation on that side of the car. Well, the good news is so far I can't find any leaks. Both pipes are in pretty shocking condition, but there's no fluid leaking out of them. It's the same could be said for the calipers. Now these two pipes kind of connect together, a little T-piece just here, and there's a flexi pipe here that goes all the way up to the top onto the underside of the body, and then there's what a relatively new copper pipe on there, probably 10 or 15 years old I guess, but that actually looks in quite a good nick, and then it goes on towards the chassis rail. So far no leaks. Right, so just following that pipe over the chassis just onto the under the side of the sill, and you can see there's a little bit of verdigris in places, some there, a bit more there, so a little bit of corrosion, but actually it's in pretty good shape. A few little kinks there, it's all good, and it ends up going down through kind of like a little bulkhead connector, which is very rusty, but it's not leaking, so that's a good sign. So far we've found no leaks in the brakes at all, so now it's going to come to the front side into the wheel arch. Now just follow that brake pipe through the bulkhead, and aha, we have found our leak. So you can see that just above that nut of the bulkhead, there is a very wet looking patch of brake pipe. It looks more like a twig than a brake pipe, to be honest. It's so rusty, which is obviously why it's leaking. But what's interesting is if I follow it further up the pipe, it then goes quite dry again. So clearly it is leaking there, not further up and running down, which is good to know. But to be honest, either way, thankfully because of that break at the bulkhead, if I disconnect it there, or I am able to, and then go up into the engine bay, almost certainly the next point it's going to connect to is going to be the master cylinder itself. So it's a relatively short bit of pipe that needs to be replaced. Let's hope it's not too seized. Well, first of all, even though it's very moist from brake fluid, I'm just going to get some penetrating fluid in there. Might help. Okay, so that's a good start. It's quite rusty, it's quite tight. There we go. Well, you can see the brake pipe twisting horribly, more fluids coming out, but it is coming apart, which is the main thing. There's rust falling off everywhere. It really is. Even though I've cleaned under here, it is still pretty disgusting. And I don't know, almost want to cover it in dirt again just to hide everything. I actually managed to snap the brake pipe clean through, I think, actually. Right, so what seems to happen is that as the pipe is twisted off, it's kind of left a bit of a tail. It's making it slightly more awkward, but we'll get there. That's great. I have to say, I did think that I was going to have to get heat involved and all kinds of stuff. But it's quite a joy that it's actually undoing quite nicely. So there we go. So that is the end of our brake pipe. So now what I need to do, go up the top side and see which one it is, how it attaches to the master cylinder. Right, well, let's have a look at these brakes. So I've got a dual master cylinder here sitting on a great big diaphragm, and that's adding power to the brakes by using the vacuum coming out of the engine's inlet manifold. Now on top of our master cylinder sits the reservoir, of course, looking dangerously empty because of our leak, but also you can see that the cylinder is actually split into two halves. there's a rod that comes from the pedal, and on the rod there are 2 pistons in 2 cylinders, so you end up with twin circuits. And the idea of that, as you can see here, you've got one pipe here, one pipe here, both going off to the bulkhead round to the passenger side, so that if one of these was to fail, you still have a little bit of braking. And it's the same story for these 2 pipes down here. They both go down to the front, but interesting, if you follow this one here, it goes all the way around down to a T-piece, and is also teed off to go to the rear. And there's actually another bit of metal here, this sort of tube, and that is sort of a balance valve. It's like a pressure reducing valve. So when you put your foot on the brakes, it stops the rear wheels locking up too readily. So it means all the stopping is going on at the front of the car, which is obviously much safer for handling. Now the bit that we're interested in is the pipe that goes into the back of that valve. That looks relatively new and clean, which is nice. Slightly more annoyingly, it's clamped to the bulkhead by a very, very tidy metal clamp, which looks like it's going to be a real nightmare to undo, but you never know, might be lucky. I think once we've undone that and undone the pipe that goes into the balance valve, I think then we should be able to pull out that pipe and then try and recreate it in some conifer, and then hopefully we'll fix our initial problem, and hopefully there will be no more problems after that with the brakes, for a while anyway. Good news is it's coming apart. So now I think it's just about loose enough. Yes, there you go. So now we're free with our pipe, so now I just have to disconnect it from the valve. Right, so first I'm just going to pop in this great big spanner here just to hold the valve in position, stop it sort of moving around. So it's going to be good to me. Oh, that's good, that's a good noise. Not a lot of room in here, but just enough. Right, brilliant. Okay, so that's now freed up. Now I've got to try and thread it out somehow. I'm just going to undo that plug. Okay. And then it's quite stiff at the end. Can I wiggle this out? It'll be fun getting this back into position, but it's got a faff here, but I think, okay, not quite, there we go. Oh, so that is our offending article. I wonder if I can find our little end again somewhere. So obviously that bit snapped off goes there like so. So what I need to do now is make myself a new pipe, but using the original fittings, nice and easy, and then hopefully we'll be back in action rather soon. Right, so that is our old brake pipe. Obviously got some new conifer to make up a new one. Now, just because it's going to be easier and because they're already here, I'm going to use the original ends off our Range Rover, but obviously this one is rather mashed. So the very first thing I need to do is just try and get the old brake pipe out of there, because in fact actually on the very, very bottom you can just about see there's like a kind of a cup, which is obviously the other end, the flared end of our brake pipe. So I need to try and get that out and then try and keep an idea roughly. I mean, it's not going to make much difference of how different, it's probably about, I don't know, maybe 10 mil long, so just have to bear that in mind when I come to cut the length of my pipe. So just going to pop that in there. So it's quite ground in this. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to literally cut it off with a grinder, maybe then clean off that back surface, and then if I have to, I'll just tap through the rest of the brake pipe with a drift. In fact, I might just give it a little bit more, just to grind it down to nothing. So that is our little end I've just cut off. So I've now got to make a new one of those on our new bit of pipe. So I'm just going to then give it a quick clean. So actually, It really isn't very rusty. And it's more the pipe than the actual fitting itself. And yeah, of course I could use a new one, but this is a quick fix. I just want to get it out to the MOT station. It is going to happen. It really is going to happen. And then it's a perfectly good part, frankly. If I was getting really tarty, I could probably give it a bit of a paint or a clean or a bit of rust remedy, but I think that's looking pretty reasonable. I'm now going to pop that onto my new pipe, 3/16. So now I have to think about how I want to flare the end. Now there are loads of different ways you can do this. You can get little handheld units or whatever. This one is slightly more sort of vice based, but I do like the tidiness of the finish. Of course it costs a bit more, but it's always worth it, I think, with this sort of thing. So now I just open that up, and there's inside here is a little die, and you can see obviously that's where the pipe is actually clamped, and that's why it's so long, to give it a really good amount of grip. And then you can see sort of like the back half of the form of the flange just there. Obviously the other end is on this little wheel here, and you can just dial in which pipe you're trying to actually sort of squish into the right position. So I just pop my pipe, actually not before I have just checked the end there, make sure there's no burrs. Tap out any swarf there. So if I now put my copper pipe in there, I've got to make sure that that end is flush with the edge there. I then put the top half of the die, swing that round, and we're ready to press. And then make sure I've got the right position on our wheel. So 3/16, the same as the die. And just pop that into position. Right, so just take out the top of the die. Now, actually, it looks pretty good, but I think we could do slightly better. If you look at that, you can see there's quite a nice form of our flare here. And obviously this is currently a male flare, if you like, and obviously what we're going to do for this end is actually make it almost like a female, like a cup, so it can receive another flare on the other side. So I've got a bit more of a stage to do, but I think what's happened over time, as is often the case with copper alloys, is that they kind of just go hard. It's been in storage for ages and ages. So what I need to do is sort of soften the metal up again, and you can do that by annealing it. So what I need to do is heat this up sort of cherry red, and then I can either just let it cool down, or even I can speed up the process by quenching it in cold water. And what that does is it kind of just rejiggles all the molecules of the metal and allows them to be processed again, to be worked again with a little bit more ease. And obviously that work will eventually harden them again, but that's fine, because by the time it's on the car, that's okay. So I think I'll just chop that off. I'm going to anneal the metal and have another go. So just get myself a bit of flame. And just gently heat up the pipe here. I'm sort of trying to use the diamond tip, if you like, of the flame. That's the hottest part. And you can see it's just starting to go cherry. I'll give myself a little bit of a head start there. And I'm just going to pop this in the water, like so. And then you can see where all that oxide is. I can just clean that off with a Scotch pad, and it looks as good as new, but now it'll be nice and soft, ready to go back in our flange tool. So again, make sure that's nice and flush with our die. Okay, so here goes again. So that's a much nicer, you can see it's just slightly sharper on the edges and things, that's quite nice, but actually I've still got one more stage to do. So I put the die back in position, clamp it back up, and then I'm just going to rotate this to operation 2. What I'm now going to do is turn that sort of, basically effectively a male flare into a female flare, so it's actually then going to join nicely onto the pipe that's already attached to the vehicle. So here we go, so make sure that's in the right place, and go again. Scratch that down. There we go. Obviously a much bigger vise is always much easier. Now, pop that round, pop that out. There we go, that's lovely. So we've now got this nice sort of cup to receive the other pipe that'll be on the other end, and that's going to sit there. You can see it's going to be a nice seal there, and once that's kind of clamped up between the two sort of male and female bits of the screw thread, if you like, you're then going to get a really good tight seal, so the hydraulic fluid will just pass through that rather than leaking out of it going into the brakes, so actually have really lovely, good firm brakes. Now I can now put the nut back on the end at that end. I now need to take the nut off the old pipe, thread it onto our pipe at the right length, redo our flare or our flange on the end of this piping, and then I can then start bending it into shape and get it back on the vehicle. Now this is a little bit harder than our copper nickel alloy because of course it's steel. It's also been there a long time, but that's now good. So I can now use my nut on this end. So I now need to put this onto my copper or conifer stuff. So the next thing I need to do is actually work out what length this is and cut it to the right length. So as it's quite short, this is relatively easy. I'll actually sort of straighten it all out. And we can put our more precise bends in. So I'm just going to straighten it here, and I'm just going to inch it along. So now obviously I've managed to cut the minimum off the end there, so probably about 5mm on each end to worry about extra. So starting at that end, say, this is probably about there-ish. We've got the bend there, so we just give that a go like so. We've got another bend here. That last little bit, back to about there. So I just need to go a little bit longer. So there, and then the last little bit. And then I'm going to add some, just to compensate for the crushing of our end. But also, you've got a little extra bit which I cut off before, so it's about there also. Right. Again, deburr the inside. Now, before I forget, I'm just going to pop the nut onto the pipe just to make sure that it's definitely there before I flare my end. So now again, just as before, I'm just going to anneal it, make it a bit softer. Right, so just clean off all the oxide on there, that's looking much better. So then pop it back, making sure that it's nice and flush with our die, like so, and then put the top again. Now this time, because I'm only going to have the single lap flare, what I want to do is go back to our original setting, so just pop that back into there, again make sure it's nicely indexed so it's all central, and here we go again. You know what, I'm just going to triple check, because half the time if these don't form properly, the main reason is because either there's a bit too much material, a bit too little material in the die. So here we go, right. I'll just pop that back out again. Oops. There we go, so nice sharp edges, it's ready to go. So now the next thing, you can put this back into the correct end, you can see it's going to fit quite nicely. So now what I need to do is actually bend this to match this. Now the cool thing about that is, as you get a little pipe bender, you can get some with just a few little lines on there, just to sort of some degrees of bending, if you like, just to give you an idea of what the bend is. And then what you can do is actually copy the bends, if you like, from the material that you are trying to copy. So in this case, if I just pop that into position, so it's going to be around there or so, about right, you can see it's give or take about 60 degrees. So if I now pop my nut into position, like so, on there, and then I can just bend it round into about our sort of 60 degrees with our bend. Now it's obviously slightly less sharp bend, but that's okay when it's on the car because it's just off that balance valve. Right, this is where things start to get a bit fiddly potentially, but if I now measure the next curve, so this one is more like, I guess, it's about probably what, 50 degrees or so, I guess, if you hold that down that so. But if I now just mark on the pipe where 0 is on this particular tool, I can then swap that out, just whiz that all the way around just so I can see it more easily. So now, if I then clamp them together with the existing bend, it gives me a much better idea of where it's supposed to be, so about there. And I'll mark on our pipe there where that bend's going to be. Now obviously I want it to go up in the angle. To be honest, if you get the angle slightly wrong, I can still twist the tube. It's actually quite good at taking a bit of that kind of stick. But to give me a rough idea, I want to go roughly in that direction. Put on there, make sure that I get my zeros to line up. And again, just double checking on my angle here. So if that's going to be like that, I'd rather prefer this to be round a little bit, like that. So you can see it's going to be going in the down direction. So then just bend it round, and again with this one I was just going to go for about 50 degrees or so. So it's about there, and while it's still in the tool I could just check that that seems about right, which it seems it is, which is cool. So then I can move on to the next one. Dial it into about that 45, 50 degrees, it will take, and so I go. So again, pretty much there, so just one more bend to go. Now obviously I can wiggle this around a little bit when it gets onto the car, but that should be, if I hold it up again, this, pretty much the same shape. So that's not bad at all, is it? It's actually come out quite well. And obviously I can tweak it a little bit once it's back onto the vehicle, but I think that's going to be a pretty good place to start. Brilliant. Now just to stop, obviously, muck and bullets getting into the end of our brake pipe, I'm just going to put a bit of tape on the end there, and then I can now stuff it down to the depths of the engine bay. So now I've got to try and thread this through. Already forgotten quite how I did it last time. It's going to go on the right hand side of that, but we'll get it in position. I need to try and get that up by the steering, which is looking quite good. Pop that into there. And this little, that's about right, so now I can do it up on the valve. Not a lot of room in here, but we're getting there. Nearly there. Right, fantastic. So now we've got our new brake pipe actually connected to our valve. We've got the other end, or the middle at least, attached to the bulkhead like it used to be. So now I've got to connect the bottom end where the leak used to be. Well, the first bit of great news is that it looks like it's going to reach. So that's quite a bonus. I'm just going to take off this protective tape. Okay, so that's now out of the way. So now we see the last bit we had before with the old pipe. This is where it was actually bent or damaged. So I'm just going to try and get it into position still. That's it. Right, well that's nice and tight. So now we've replaced our brake pipe, which is great. So obviously now I need to bleed the brakes, but of course bear in mind again this vehicle has been standing for a very long time. Brake fluid is also hygroscopic, which means it does absorb moisture from the air. It's the kind of thing I should do before I go to the MOT anyway. So I'm now going to pop all the wheels off and then bleed the brakes around the whole of the vehicle. Right, now, because this brake fluid has been here quite a while, what I think I might try and do is just remove as much as I can from the reservoir before I put in the new stuff. There is a little problem with that. There is like a little baffle in here. Take the two chambers separate. So I'll see what I can get out. I'm going to try and disturb as little as possible everywhere else in the braking system, so I don't really want to undo perhaps the brake switch or any of these other pipes here, but I'll just see what I can do with a syringe, because every little helps and all that. So here we go. So you can see it's quite a good safety feature. So basically that second chamber is going to stay full even if this one drains out completely. So it's obviously how this car protects you from any leakages. At least you're going to have some brakes. Okay, that's as much as I'm going to get out of there. It's still a reasonable amount, so I think I might have to try something else as well. Right, well, when it comes to bleeding brakes on a classic car like this, you should always go for the bleed nipple that's furthest away from the master cylinder first, just to get all that air and old fluid out. It's the most efficient way of doing it, so that makes sense. My worry on this particular car is this has been here rotting for quite some time, so I've just put some penetrating fluid on all of them, and that'll kind of work its magic, and hopefully this one will actually get undone at least. But once it is out, I'm just going to replace it with a brand new one, just as a matter of course, because after all, if it's been even slightly corroded, of course it's much, much weaker, and then the next time we come to do this, I want to make sure it's actually going to work okay, and they're quite cheap things. So as far as the bleeding is concerned, I've actually got the option of pressurising the system at that end. Hopefully that'll push the air and all that old bad fluid out through the nipple once we've got the replacement one in place. But if that doesn't work, I've also got the option of using this device here. I can actually connect an air line to this, and when I actually push the air through that system, what's going to happen is it's actually going to cause a Venturi effect and actually effectively a vacuum inside here, so it'll also suck from this end. So I'll be pushing from that end, suck from this end, we will get these brakes bled. It was a bit of a worry, because obviously if I break this off, then, oh, I think we've got away with that. Because to snap it off at this point would have been a real pain. That's quite good, so I'll just tweak that out. So that's the old one. The fluid is flowing, which is good. Pop that back in. And then just to make sure, I'm just going to do it up first of all and then back it off a tiny bit. Ready for our bleeder. Right, so now I'll go and pressurise the other end, and we should see the fluid appear magically here. You can see still got a couple of bubbles coming through. Okay, now it's cleared up. So now it's pretty much air free. So there's quite a lot of air in the system at this end. So now I'm just going to close that up like so. Make sure, give it a nice bit of a clean. I mean, if the brakes still feel a little bit spongy after on the whole system, I might come back to this, but it looks pretty good at the moment. Right, so now I've done this side, I can go over to the other side. But it's quite nice that we've got away without having to use the vacuum. So that little bit of pressure has made all the difference. Now bear in mind that the system, even though it's stale, has brake fluid still in it, so of course it's a lot easier to push that through than it is perhaps air with a sort of a load of fluid at the very one end of it. So it's a lot easier to do this than it would be to start with a whole new system that's never had any fluid in it. I'll have to get a dust cap for that later. Right, on to the next one. Now, quite interesting, while I've been bleeding this rear driver's side brake, I've noticed a little souvenir of John's off-roading days, where he's obviously mown down a tree. There's a log, or at least a branch, wedged in here between our damper and the brakes. So I'll see if I can wedge that out. So, looks like it's been there a long time. Oh, it's going. Now the brakes on our Range Rover at the front are slightly different to the rears. Obviously you've still got discs and calipers, but you notice there are two brake pipes here because there's a dual circuit. So the idea is that should there be a problem, maybe get a leak in the system somewhere, actually the other half will still work and still stop you. So it just kind of gives you a little bit of extra peace of mind. What that does mean though is I've now got 3 bleed nipples to deal with. And the idea on this system is you have a primary and a secondary, you do those together simultaneously, and then once those are sorted out and bled, you then do the one on the outside. So I now need an extra tube, so I'll put that on there as well, but again the same problem. I think I'll just change the bleed nipples, particularly the one that no longer has a head. Despite being snapped off, it still works. And these ones are new, they're just not quite as shiny as the others. You can see the brake fluid is going everywhere, so I will give it a good clean with some brake cleaner a little bit. Right, so they're all new and nipped up, so now we can start bleeding them in sequence. So you can see the colour of this stuff is very unpleasant, so it's well worth doing. That's looking pretty good actually. So as we know, there is still plenty of fluid in here, so there shouldn't be too much air to worry about. So those two are done. So now we'll just pop that onto this side. See a few tiny little bubbles, I'll just let them go through. One more to go. Right, so all 4 calipers have now been bled, so the next question is, how good is the pedal? Right, well I'm not even going to start to the engine with this. I don't want the vacuum assistance, I want to feel the pedal in its raw state. So, oh, thank goodness, it is rock solid, which is great. I'm now going to keep the pressure on and just feel if the pedal starts to move away from me, because that would mean there is still a leak somewhere in the system, or perhaps there is some air still to compress. But thankfully, it's also not moving anywhere, which is great. So if we have a good pedal, the next thing to find out is whether the brakes are actually going to stop the car. And for that, I need to pop the wheels back on and get out of the workshop. But the good news there is I then get to find out whether our quick fix with the transmission has actually worked and whether we now have a smooth transition into the gears. Well, fingers crossed. Wow, it does seem that that little fix has transformed the transmission, which is quite exciting. I don't know how long it's going to last, but I only have to go a couple of miles to get down to the MOT station, so that is a good sign. I think this is obviously the furthest it's been in, well, 12 odds years or so. Also, the brakes do seem vastly improved, which is fantastic. So it means at least we can stop with a hint of confidence, which is rather lovely. But we want to see if they really, really work, because let's face it, it'd be nice to have a little bit of an emergency stop. Oh, I heard the movement of gravel under rubber. That is fantastic. So that's good. It has stalled, but that's fine. It's a fuel injection. It's bound to. Okay, so this car does have a lot of issues, but we have a date with destiny. Here goes. This is it. We are actually on our date with destiny. We are driving on the way to the MOT station. So far everything seems okay. We are stuck in first gear, but that's okay. We're still driving nicely. What could possibly go wrong? You know what? This is actually rather comfortable to drive. It is classic Range Rover. This is why I can't stop buying these things and driving them around. And even though it's old and moth-eared and unpleasant, it's still very comfortable. Okay, the engine's revving a little bit high, but hey. And it's maybe a little bit smoky coming in from the rear window, which is jammed open, but that's all right. And okay, there's a bit of wind noise from all the doors that aren't shut, but that's okay too. Okay, I'm running out of power. Well, so far it's going kind of well. I'm about halfway to the MOT station, got to the first hill, and it is a very steep hill, and I've lost drive completely. I've managed to get the car just safely off the road, but the thing is, what happened before was when the transmission water got a bit hot after I let it cool down, I got a bit of drive back. So I'm hoping our quick fix, even though it hasn't quite worked, it may fix itself the same way. So if I let the engine and gearbox cool down, maybe I'll still make it all the way to the test centre. So in the meantime, while I'm waiting for it to cool down, I might as well read some of your questions. Well, it does seem that so many of you are very interested in exactly how long the list of failures is going to be for this MOT test, and I have to say I'm with you on that, and I don't think any of us are going to be disappointed. And I've got a very specific question here from Tortop45. Any boot floor and outriggers left, Ed? Well, actually, as you've probably seen or been working underneath the car, there's not a lot connecting the bodywork to the chassis, and we'll have to address that later on, but I just want to see just how much stuff we're going to be failing this test on. Now, I've got another little tip here, really, from JDM Jesus. And he's got top tip for getting stubborn brake nipples undone. Use a hammer. It says bash the end straight on until it starts to mash over. Don't hit it from one side. This will loosen the thread and any rust. This will then still work, but you're changing it anyway, it doesn't matter one bit. I've never snapped a bleed nipple since I've started using this method. Well, that's a very good top tip, but interestingly also, there's a little tip here from Eddie84, and he's saying you have a crusty bleed nipple, put a shank of a drill bit down the center before you undo it, and of course that adds a bit of strength and supports the inside of the threads, so it stops them from collapsing and stops the whole thing from twisting off, which is quite clever as well. So a lot of really useful tips, so thank you very much for that. Now, while I'm stuck at the side of the road, I'm reminded of some of your brilliant comments or alternatives to my dog eggs and road apples. We've got bark eggs, land mines, which I actually thought was pertaining to cow pats. Also, my favourite so far, meadow muffins. Brilliant. Keep them coming. And on that note, let's get this unpolished turd back on the road. Well, let's try. We're actually here, we've made it all the way to the MOT station. This is very exciting. I just had a quick chat with Jason, the MOT tester. I think it went as well as could be expected. He has just asked for some more paper, which isn't ideal, but I do think we're going to be in for a bit of a long wait. You know, I can't believe that it's taken quite so long as it has to get that Range Rover barely drivable and then get it all the way to the MOT station, but it is there as promised. And now it's out of our workshop and out of our hands. We're at the mercy of the ministry, and we'll deal with the fallout from that debacle on another day. But now we've got a nice bit of space, it's a good opportunity to remind you to click subscribe and also click the bell to get those notifications, but also I can answer some questions. And we've got one here, a brilliant question from Lucas Schnook. Is the sister company of Ansel called Gretel, and does it sell socks? Well, that is a brilliant idea, and if it isn't already a thing, it really should be, so I'll talk to the powers that be. It should become perhaps part of my range of Edd gear, who knows? Right, another question here from Luke KC. What has been your favourite car you've ever worked on, and what car would you like to work on but haven't? Well, going back to wheeler dealers, there were so many cars that were great fun, but I think the Lamborghini Huracan was just a fantastic car. It was amazing to get a bull into the China shop. And actually, it wasn't so much working on the car that was amazing. Obviously, it was all about the test drive in the Dolomites, the sound of that engine. Oh. That was fantastic! That flat plain V8 sounds so good, but there are other cars from wheeler dealers as well that I really enjoyed playing around with. The Cadillacs, for example, that was a real great challenge, trying to make a rally car, first of all, out of nothing, out of just rust and bits of wood, but then also trying to turn it into a rally car as if I was an Edwardian gent of that era, using components from that period. Really, really good fun, and obviously we'll see more of that as the show progresses, but of course we've got quite a few projects just to finish off first. Now, another thing we actually played around with, of course, as well, which was great fun, was actually electrifying a Gibbs high-speed amphibian, the Aquada. Now that was awesome fun, and it really was an amazing thing to then go and set a record with it once we'd done all that electrification work. Now, when it comes to my own projects, obviously the casual loafer, the sofa car, is very dear to my heart, and it's quite good that I quite enjoy working on it because I have to do an awful lot of work, particularly when we drove it from LA to San Francisco and back again. It broke down almost every single day because of a long-standing overheating problem. Now, I have got loads of projects that I'm looking forward to getting stuck into just in this workshop alone. Obviously, we've got the Tornado drop tank to make that salt flat race, so that'll be great fun. The giant shopping trolley, I really need to get cracking with that because I really want to get that back on the road as well. But then we've got all these other projects like the Luaz, the amphibian from the Ukraine, really looking forward to trying to get that back here and then trying to get it working and then go for a bit of a swim, which would be great. And talking of water, obviously we've got a boat project in the pipeline as well, so it'd be great to get on there. But if we're getting back to cars, those cars I never quite got round to working on, then I would love one day to work on a Duesenberg. Fantastic, amazing car from the 30s, a wonderful thing. But also one day it'd be quite wonderful to work on a magical, mythical car such as Chitty Chitty Bang Bang. That would be amazing. Anyway, enough of all that fantasy stuff. We should get back to doing something while the workshop is nice and empty, and I've got a couple of jobs in mind. Now, my next job isn't actually on the Range Rover, it's on the trailer behind. And the thing about owning a trailer is eventually word gets out and you end up with a queue of friends needing to borrow it, which is all good. But the thing about trailers is they spend most of the time usually outside in the yard somewhere in the elements. And of course that means that the wiring on them can start to degrade over time. And then also that's the same sort of situation with the tow bar electrics. Now eventually that does mean that you can end up with some kind of issue with the wiring. People then start to try and fix it and you can end up with the problem problem even bigger than when you first started. Now unfortunately that even seems to be the case now with my own trailer. Most recently a friend came to borrow it, they connected everything up, checked the lights before they left, and unfortunately there was an issue with the indicators. Now wiring can bamboozle people a little bit, and in fact they were stuck out there for some time while I was busy filming just trying to work out what the problem was. And they even called out a roadside assistance company, and even they were too worried about the wiring to actually get stuck in and work out what the issue is. Now at the end of the day, wiring really isn't anything to be scared of. It's just a matter of breaking down a bigger problem to smaller and smaller parts until you can get to the root of the issue. Now in the case of the trailer, before I even check anything on that, I'm going to make sure that the electrics on my tow bar on this car are in good order. Right, well now this little gizmo here is actually going to help me test the electrical socket on the back of my Range Rover. You can see actually I've got quite a lot of stuff going on here because I've got this adapter which goes from the conventional 7-pin connectors to the more modern 13-pin connector that's coming out of the trailer. Now the 12S socket is actually for the caravan. That has the reversing light but also 3 power supplies. There's a 12-volt sort of main supply, there's a supply for a fridge and also a supply for an auxiliary battery on board the caravan, or in this case our trailer, because it's got loads of hydraulics on it, it needs a battery to run all of that. Now first thing I'm going to do is just disconnect this adapter and pop in my special little connector here and just twist it around like so. So now straight away I've got a little light just to show that I've actually got some power going on. So I now take this to the cab and I can then start operating the lights and just see which ones are working. Right, I'm just closing the door to make sure that the car doesn't complain. So now I'm in here, I can turn on the ignition and I'll just turn on the lights to start with. So side lights are working. Main beam's working, that means I can then use the fog light. I can try the brake lights, that's all good. Right indicator, it's good. Left indicator is also good as well. So I'll just put the old hazards on there. That's all fine. So if I just now start her up, I can now also then see we've got an ignition feed going to the back end, and also then theoretically there's a reverse light as well. So that's good. So we have a full set, which is rather good. So that means that all of the lights are working on the car at least, so I can now plug the trailer back in knowing that everything I do in the car should then operate the trailer correctly. Right, so now what I can do is I can actually use the Range Rover as a way of operating the lights on the trailer, so it's nice and simple. So just swap that back over again. Smashing. Right, so here we go. Right then, so here we go. We're going to put the ignition back on. Right, so now let's try out the lights. I've got my little mirror so I can see what's going on. So we've got our side lights, which is great. And again, if I just put got brake lights, that's good. And we've got the fog lights at the bottom, and just to double check, we'll just put the engine on again. And let's just try out the reverse. Yes, we've got reverse as well. So we've got our full set of normal lights, but how have we got our indicators? So if I now put the indicators to the left, well clearly the car you can hear has got indicators, but I can't see anything at all on the trailer. On the right, we now have both indicators very handily, so I can see what their problem was. So basically, if I now put the hazards on, well, as you'd expect, you have both of them working for the hazards, but not very helpfully. When you're trying to turn right, you have both lights on. When you're trying to turn left, you have no lights on, which is quite dangerous. So obviously I need to try and work out what the problem is. So the first thing I'm going to do is disconnect the coupling and then start checking for shorts just to see what's going on with those indicators. I'll just make my life a little bit easier. So I've now got my wiring diagram on my phone, just giving it a bit of a Google. I've got my continuity sorted out on my multimeter there, so I should be able to find some earths. And now what I'm going to do is just disconnect this again, like so. Just put it somewhere useful, perhaps there, like that. Right, so now I can work out what we're looking for. So we're looking basically for the indicators. So number 3 pin there is actually the earth. So if I touch this to the chassis of the trailer itself, that bottom pin goes straight to earth, which is brilliant. And then just next to that, you've got pin number 4 and pin number 1. Pin number 4 is actually the right-hand indicator. So we have some sort of, well, basically some continuity, but obviously there is a resistance there because of course it's going to go through an LED bulb, because this trailer is LED, not just good old incandescent. And then I go to the other pin. Interesting. So there's actually a break in the circuit here. So for the left-hand indicator, there's actually no connection. Right hand is definitely something going on. Left hand there definitely isn't, which is kind of interesting. So we obviously have a break in the wire. So what I need to do now is start tracing it through the trailer itself to see if I can work out where that break might be, if I can see any obvious trapped wires perhaps, or maybe it's actually broken, the worst case scenario, of course it's broken somewhere between here and where I can actually get to the wires. But I'll start by looking inside the trailer to see what I can find. I've got myself a jump pack and a power probe so I can actually add some voltage into the circuitry so I can see what's going on. If I just undo these lids on both sides, that now gives me access to the wiring loom of the trailer on both sides of the unit. And you can see it's actually quite a useful little box. It's got kind of these tracks of terminals there, and there's also some instructions on the inside of the lid, which is very handy, just to remind you what each of the colours of the wires are doing, what their function is, so it makes it easier to follow what's going on. Now this side basically handles all the lighting on this side of the vehicle, as you'd expect. On this side, you can see there's actually a lot more wires, and that's because this is actually also connecting the wiring looms from the front of the trailer into the back, and it also handles all the wiring for this side of the vehicle. So the first thing I'm going to do is just take my power probe and just connect in to this side. So first of all, I'm just going to energise the various cables. And you can see here we've actually got the white wire, which is the earth, we know that, is going to go all the way up this track here, and you've got the green wire going just next door to it. So if I now just connect up to the white wire, and then that's our earth, and I'm just going to connect our positive to the other side. So there we go. So we've got the indicator, and on both sides, as we knew from before. So that's kind of interesting. So at the moment, we obviously have this broken wire, it seems, for the yellow, for the left-hand side, but actually for the right-hand side, it's actually wiring both. So there's also some kind of short. Now, normally with trailer wiring, it's all about bad earths, but you can see with these little boxes and their tracks that obviously you've got a number of opportunities for the earth to connect to the earth wire, and we obviously knew we had a good earth further back. So in this particular occasion, it's not about that, it's about some other strange confusion, if you like. So if I was to disconnect the one on here, let's just take that one off. And if I now just, but again, I'll connect it to the earth and then just connect it again. So interesting now. So it's actually wiring that. So you can see that this wire here, this little green one here, is actually coming from this side, and it's actually, it seems, energizing the lights on that side and not this one. So obviously the light unit here must be one of these other cables going in here. So while this feed is off, I'm now going to put the probe on here again. So now you can see we've got our indicator on that side, but not on the other. So what that means is this wire here is actually the feed from that side of the trailer, which is kind of interesting. And when it's disconnected, obviously that works as it should do, but obviously when we connect to that, it's still shorting up there. So it means that the problem is on this side. So I'll just put this back in position again, just to be absolutely sure. Right, let's get back over this side. Right, so I'm just basically working through all the various possibilities where the issues are, sort of breaking this big problem down to a smaller and smaller area. So we now know that we've got our green wire seems to have some kind of short over this side. So obviously there is a bit of wire or a cable going all the way through the inside of the trailer. And if I now look at this, I'll just get a light on there actually, just so I can see a bit more clearly. There are two multi-core cables here, both with green wires. So very simply now, if I actually just take off one of these green wires, I can hopefully then work out, connect up my earth again, put that in there like so, and now if I now put some power onto here, brilliant. So that is the wire that seems to be going onto that side of the loom, which was great. So now the other one is on this track here. So if I now just put some power to that, so at the moment we've still got a connection somehow from the right hand running its way through to the left hand light. Now what's interesting is this other green wire must be the wire that comes all the way from the front of the vehicle. If I disconnect that as well, then just to double check, if I just connect this up again, that wiring problem should still be there, I guess, which it is. But it means that then I've now disconnected from the socket that's all the way at the front of the vehicle. So essentially now we now know that whatever else is on this track is probably the root of our problem, because obviously neither of them are supposed to be there. Now what's interesting is there is a brown wire at the top here. Now that doesn't mean it's already wrong just because it's the wrong colour, but it means it's obviously some other device. And if I actually just follow it around, it's quite simple. It's been crimped onto a black wire, which then goes into this kind of metallic thing here with this sort of heatsink. That's actually a resistor. And of course, because these light units are actually LED, then they don't use as much current as an incandescent bulb, which means that the relay on a car at the very front that's towing this may have the timer, the flasher duration, may be controlled by a kind of like a little bimetallic strip heating up and then cooling down again once it's broken. Therefore, it needs a certain amount of current for that to work, so that adding the resistor increases the current, which means that that bimetallic strip will actually click on and off correctly. So obviously sometimes with an LED light, for example, or almost like a broken bulb, the car will think there's nothing there, and you end up with this sort of flashing that's happening much more quickly. So that's what the resistor is for. But the interesting thing is the resistor on this side. And you'd think that the resistor for this side would actually be for this light unit. So if I look at the other end and see where that follows into, and interestingly that connects to another track which goes onto the earth. So one side of the earth, as you'd expect, the resistor goes on there, the other side goes into the indicator. So if I just now go back onto that side and have another quick look. So there's a resistor on this side as well, which is great, and the one side goes onto the earth, which is good, and the other side actually connects onto the green track, as you'd expect it to do. So it's what looks like perhaps this wire is just in the wrong place. So let's have a look. Where is our yellow wire going to? So the yellow wire goes onto the track that's furthest to the back of the trailer. I might just cheekily unplug that. It does look like it's had a bit of a hard time. It looks like it's been pinched in the housing there as well. So maybe somebody's pulled it, jiggled it or something, pulled it off, not sure where it's gone, and then connected it back up again. Right, so just pop that wire where I think it should go on the same track as our yellow or our left indicator. So now, if I operate that side, we've now got an indicator working there for sure, and because of course we know that the cable goes from this side to that side, I can also operate the green wire, which is the right hand indicator, and that should work there a treat as well. So we've now definitely got connections working properly. So we no longer have a short on our right hand indicator or our green wire, and we no longer have this kind of open circuit on the left hand or the yellow wire, which is fantastic. So it really was as simple as that. Just somebody had obviously at some point pulled off a wire by mistake, popped it back in the wrong position thinking that was okay, and of course then we ended up with this issue. And that's often the case with wiring. It's normally something very simple. It's just got to do a little bit of detective work to actually find out what the problem is. So now this is all good. I'm just going to double check we've got continuity at the connector just by the tow hitch, and then we can connect up to the car and make sure that our indicators work. Right, well, just to prove to myself I've definitely fixed it, I'm just going to double check the socket again. So we've got our earth. So the first of all, we'll check the right hand indicators, which still work, thankfully, and then we'll check the left hand indicators, and they also now work, which is wonderful. So theoretically, well, I now connect this back up to the Range Rover and try using the indicators, we should have some flashing lights in all the right places. Right, so here we go again. So I'm just going to put on the ignition and then try the indicators. So, oh, look at that. So our right hand indicator works a treat. And the left-hand indicator works a treat. So we have totally fixed it. So now, get on with the next job. Now, this next job is really more working on the workshop than in the workshop, and it's going to be one of those little jobs which is on a massive long list of unfinished things to do on our mezzanine. Now, many of you would have seen Mrs. C and myself slaving away on this ridiculous structure during lockdown, and it all started really with this big circular disc. It was a second-hand show stand. It came with this amazing spiral staircase. As soon as we'd seen it, we had to have it, but unfortunately, when I started putting it up, it was a bit too low, so I had to raise it by about a foot, which meant, of course, that the stairs no longer reached the ground, so I had to add a couple more steps on the bottom there, and then we carried on working with all other bits and pieces that we could get hold of. So we got hold of some second-hand industrial flooring to put up there, even some second-hand carpet tiles as well. Now, the whole point of the mezzanine wasn't just to waste valuable time when we had far more important things to do during lockdown. No, it was to create an alternative space in the workshop, a haven, a sanctuary, a place where things are a little bit different. It's really a change of gear for your head, somewhere to contemplate big dreams and great ideas. A place to plan your next grand project, especially the ones that are never going to see the light of day. It's my procrastination space. And because of that, it obviously has to be comfortable and cozy. It's a place to hang with your mates, hence lots of sofas, just in case I do get inspired to do a bit of work. Obviously, we've got some desks over there. And eventually, one day, we're going to actually cover our wonderful petrol blue wall with books and TVs and all kinds of other exciting things. We're even going to have a bar at some point. But that is the thing. Because this is a procrastination space, nothing is quite yet finished. And so I really should crack on with my next job, which is to finish off my balustrade. Now, because our mezzanine is so far off the ground, obviously had to be nice and safe and put up a balustrade. And I couldn't help but go for a bit of stainless steel because it adds a nice bit of bling to the whole place. And of course, it's going to outlive not only the mezzanine, but also the entire building as well. But the thing about it is, because of all the curves of our mezzanine, rather than having facets, I went for some custom bent tubing to go for the top rails. Now, the one for the front of the mezzanine, well, that actually came in two pieces, had to be welded together. The one for the rear here also came in two pieces, but I've got to cut that up further to actually get it to fit into each of these sections, and that is my next job. So the idea, I have this stainless steel knuckle here, that's going to just sit like so, connecting to this beam, this radial beam there, and this little chap here is going to be about there or so. So what I need to do is just cut this tubing down, and so I need to mark this out. So just a little bit of masking tape, a bit of pen, and shouldn't take that long. There we go. Doesn't really matter where I put this, because I'm just going to then mark it out afterwards. So I've got to be a little bit careful because it's just balancing on the rest of the poles at the moment. It's not actually attached. So then I'm just going to mark that out by eye. So I'm just making sure I'm dead above the seam. So I'm just checking on both sides. So there's definitely no chance of any parallax issues. Now I've got my two marks, one either side, I now need to make a little hoop, and obviously I need to make sure it's pretty accurate, because obviously whether I cut it with a power saw or even just an angle grinder, I want to make sure I have a nice square edge when it comes up to this knuckle. Now you could use perhaps like some kind of hose clip perhaps and wrap it round, or you could use all kinds of other things. I'm just going to use a little bit of card here, and just literally whiz that all the way around and make sure that the card is square. I mean, you could even do this with just the masking tape itself. So now I'm happy that I've got in the right place. I'm just going to make sure, yet again, that when it's on the knuckle, it looks pretty good, which it does, and then I can literally now just draw around that all the way in the comfort of the fact that it's hopefully now going to be a nice square edge. Oops. So now we've done that, I'll just mark out the others and get cutting. So here we go. This is our first long length. Slots onto there, rests on there, and the last bit, of course, is this T-piece like so. And that should sit on there. Now a bit later on, I'll get round to actually attaching these little tops onto there and gluing everything together. But before I do that, I want to now see how everything else is looking. Right, so the last piece well, that is a wonderful fit for one thing, but it now looks absolutely fantastic. And once I've glued it all together and given it a nice kind of dressing with a bit of 320 grit wet and dry and some oil just to get rid of those forming scratches, this is ready for the next stage. And the next stage is a whopping great piece of shaped glass, a couple of stools, we'll then have a bar. But that is a job for another day.
Thanks for stopping by the workshop. If you enjoyed the video even just a little bit, then click like. If you hated it, well then click like 3 times. Also remember to leave your thoughts and your questions in the comments. And obviously we'd love to see you again soon, so please remember to click subscribe if you haven't already, and click the bell for notifications of when the next video is published or when I have some intriguing news.